Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of our Grow Summer Sessions. We're so glad that you can join us tonight. Maybe you're joining us live. If you're joining us live on YouTube, just want to say welcome. My name is Luke. I'm one of our pastors here at Living Waters Church, and tonight I'll be your host. If you're not joining us live, maybe you're joining us at a later time. We're so glad that you're watching this recording, and welcome to you as well. We've been enjoying these Grow Summer Sessions throughout the summer, covering all kinds of topics and conversations. And one of the conversations that we held most dearly and that we were most interested in having was a conversation about racism in Canada. We've all been a part to some degree of understanding what's been going on in the last number of months, and all of us are caught up into the history and the life of Canada and the world, and there's a lot of conversation going on about inequality and racism right now, and Living Waters has been participating in that conversation, and this is one of those moments where we continue the conversation. And we're really happy tonight to welcome Jennifer Adkins. Jennifer has just signed on in a new role at Trinity Western University as the VP of Inclusive Excellence, and that's at the executive leadership table. She's a sociologist. She's just wrapping up her PhD, so she's got really a lot of time and energy on her hands right now. So with that said, we're so thankful that she's taken the time to prepare something to share, and for us to be able to discuss a little bit after that. Jennifer and her family have been a part of Living Waters Church for, we were talking earlier, 11 years. And one of the things that I just love about Jennifer is not only her insight, not only her generosity in who she is as a person, but really her humility. And I really mean this, Jennifer, whenever we have a conversation, I really feel like I've had a conversation with someone who's been with Jesus. And I know that takes a long time of cultivating that kind of relationship with God. And so we're so thankful that Jennifer's coming today to share from an academic perspective, but as also someone coming from a faith perspective. So as I said, Jennifer's going to share for about 30 minutes, and there's a lot to be said, and we can't say everything, but she's going to share for about 30 minutes. And then after that, she and I will have a conversation, and I've prepared a few questions for us. But we're also going to invite you to ask questions. If you're joining us live in the comment section on YouTube, you can type in questions. So please feel free to do that, either when Jennifer's sharing or when we're having the conversation. And I'm going to do my best to address some of those questions if I can. So thanks again for joining us, whether you're joining us live or you're joining us at a later date. And thanks so much for joining us, Jennifer. In our room tonight, Ricky's joining us on the back end tech-wise. Ethan and Scott are with us. Joanne, aka Mom, is with us. And so we're really happy to be in this room together. And we're really thankful for you, Jennifer, that you're willing to share your heart with us and your insight with us. So please welcome Jennifer as she comes. Thanks.
Let's start with prayer. God, I am so grateful for the opportunity to speak, and I just ask you to fill me with your words, with your realness, with your honesty. I ask you please to touch the hearts and open hearts. I ask you please just to bring calm and to bring healing to those who have been hurt through all that's gone on and those who are confused. I just ask you please to lead this conversation and help me to speak your truth and be with us through this entire experience. In Jesus' name we pray. Okay, so I am going to start by just saying something that Luke didn't mention and that many of you may not know about me, is that I knew, and I'm uncomfortable saying that I was destined to work in the area of race relations and anti-racism. From the moment that I walked into my first year at University of Alberta in my undergraduate, I went to an anti-racism workshop and something was happening to me. My heart was pumping and my mouth was dry and I couldn't sit still, and it felt like something was planted in me. So that awakening that happened, I figured that that was God's call. And then something changed. I actually worked in the area, first of all, for about 20 years in Edmonton with the school board, with some private organizations, with not-for-profit, with for government. And I did a lot of anti-racism / diversity work. I thought that would be carrying me through and still wasn't feeling fully fulfilled. And then my husband, Scott, got a transfer and a promotion, and we moved to BC. And at that point, I started to teach at Trinity, and I was sure that the idea of doing this kind of work had ended. Then I went back to do my doctorate in sociology. But while I was doing that, I was noticing, as I was in church and Christian circles, I was saddened and concerned. I was sensitive to racism, and a lot of people around me were unaware of it. I witnessed segregation even within my community, and people didn't seem to see it, and they actually explained it away. So if you ask me what my deepest secret was, or one of them anyway, is that I would tell you that it was that I desired for God to use me in churches and Christian organizations to fight racism, to do anti-racism work. So much has been going on, and I find myself reading an old devotional that my dad had. He's passed, and so I use it ever since then. I read a couple weeks ago, "No desire would be placed in me that God doesn't intend to fill." But there was a full stop in the work, and I wasn't sure what was going on. If I continue reading, it says, "Except for yourself, all the promises of his word, all the desires he awakens within you, and all the possibilities of what you could become as a follower of Jesus." I learned that God put me in a period of waiting, which a more recent devotional described as a locked up to faith. And it explains that Paul, Silas, John, and I would throw Joseph, Jacob's son, in there, went through. They were locked up in faith to learn and be prepared for the mission. I've come to see that vision that I had was definitely from God. It's my firm belief that Christians should lead in the fight against racism. And I believe that God desires racial reconciliation. There won't be racism in heaven, and there won't be segregated mansions. We'll be one, and we'll have to live as one. So I'm wondering, I pose a question to you, where do we begin this process? My answer to that would be by living his kingdom here on earth. So I'd like to start this conversation, and hopefully we'll continue through the weeks, months, and years to come. I want to thank definitely you, Luke, for inviting me to do this. I appreciate it. And I also want to thank Living Waters Church for bending and being so malleable during a time where it came unexpectedly, willing to adapt and increase their knowledge and awareness on racism, and just being very humble through the process. And I also want to thank you for watching, and of course, Scott and Ethan and Joanne. And I can't forget you back there either, Ricky. All right, so let's start. What I want to do tonight is, first of all, talk about the whole concept of race, where it began. Then I want to talk about the general history of racism, and then go into the more specifics about Canada. Hopefully at the end, you'll provide us with some questions, and Luke, myself, and you will have a conversation. So let's start with race. So the term race never really started with the intent of meaning biology or genetics. There was no intent behind it. It was actually used in the 16th century to refer to kinship, shared ancestry, group affiliation, and members of the same household. It was around the 17th or 18th centuries that a shift took place, and it was because of two major events. So the events were a rise of global capitalism, and that was supported by slavery and colonialism around the 15th to the 17th century. And the second would be the Enlightenment period in Europe. So I'm guessing right now you're asking yourself, Didn't racism actually start before the 17th century? I thought even the Bible mentioned slavery. And I would say that's very astute of you. Yes, it's true. The strange fact is that racism took place well before it was named. And the new idea of race came after acts of racism took place in the world. So what I'm going to do is take you even further back, and we'll start with the history of racism, which makes no sense, but you'll understand. Yes, racism actually took place well before the idea of race, the concept of race, came into being. It just didn't have a name. So as far back as 384 to 322 BC, at a time of Greek superiority, Aristotle developed the climate theory. And it was intended to justify Greek dominance. Aristotle came up with the idea that extreme weathers, climates, like being very hot or being very cold, produce physical, intellectual, and moral inferiority of peoples. He considered their appearances, both dark and pale people, ugly. In fact, the word Ethiopian is Greek for burnt faces. I didn't know that. I learned that in my research. And the paleness, he figured, came from the cold climates and was disgusted by them as well. In Aristotle's mind, Greece had the best climate and therefore produced superior individuals. Romans justified slavery after Christ's birth using Aristotle's climate theory. The Puritans studied Aristotle as well as early theologians, and they started to impose a Greek or a God-ordained hierarchy. But Paul's exhortation in Galatians 3:28, you know what it is. There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor male or female. Basically, what he's saying there is that we're all one in Christ. That poked holes through their theory. Race or racism didn't exist, even in early history, but for reasons of justifying superiority, the seeds of prejudice, discrimination, and oppression were planted. So there are people who were opponents to Aristotle's beliefs, and I won't go through all of them because I should be conscious of the time. I didn't start my clock, so I'm going to rely on you, Luke, to tell me when I'm going over. But one was Herodotus. Did I say that properly? And he's a historian, and he himself said Nubians or blacks were the most handsome people. Lactantius was the advisor to Constantine, and he said that the God who creates and inspires men wished them all to be fair, meaning equal. St. Augustine was one of the first fathers of the African church, said that whoever is born anywhere as a human being, that is a rational, mortal creature, however strange they may appear to our senses and bodily form. Let no true believer have any doubt that such an individual is descended from one who man was first created. I'm going to skip to the 14th and 15th century, where a Tunisian named Ibn Khaldun, I believe, a Tunisian scholar of Aristotle, who used the climate theory. He actually justified the Islamic enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans and Eastern Europeans. The Eastern Europeans were called Slavs. And so an interesting point that I wanted to point out is that Slavs actually is a root word of slaves. They were considered Slavs, which was synonymous with slaves. And by about the 1440s, African enslavement increased so much that the name changed to slaves, and they became the natural slave. And the last one I'm going to talk to you about is the curse of Ham. And it's a theory that I hadn't heard before. I heard but didn't really know until I started to do a little bit of studying based on Genesis 9:18 to 29. And it's a story of when Noah drank too much and he got drunk and he was exposed, and one of his sons came in, and instead of doing something about it, he ran back and told his brothers. Anyway, the story goes that, well, Noah cursed him when he found out what happened. So as Persians, Islamic, and Jewish and Christian scholars interpreted it, Ham was black. So Ham is a brother who was cursed. And so they decided that he was black. But in doing some more research, I found that David Goldberg, who did about 13 years of research, he's a historian, found that the term ham that many misread meant dark, black, and heat was not the case. It wasn't the word that Hebrews and, actually it wasn't Hebrews, I think Muslims and Christians were trying to explain. So it took that meaning and brought it into another place altogether and came in handy after some time. It became the justification in the Middle Ages of Black enslavement. Okay, so if we were to go back to what I started to talk to you about the meaning of race, I would start at what I said before, the shift that took place, the two major shifts that took place in the 17th and 18th century. So the one was a rise of global capitalization or capitalism, and it supported slavery and colonialism. So we know that Spanish colonization started in the Caribbean and Latin America in about the 1400s. Now, indigenous people were actually used as forced labor and were working under brutal conditions, mining for silver and gold. In the 1600s, English colonies tried to impose the enslavement of indigenous people. They weren't finding gold, and so they moved on to tobacco. Because of the resistance of indigenous settlers or people, the settlers relied on enslaved Africans and indentured Europeans, as I said earlier. Enlightenment period, during 1715 and 1789, race was shaped into ideology. Through scientists, politicians, philosophers, and ministers, they started to use the idea of inherent inferiority and started to use classification systems. The classification became very popular. Philosophers like Locke and Kant insisted that non-white groups lacked history and lacked culture, therefore they were subordinate and less valued. The first person to use a classification system was Carolus Linnaeus, and that was about in 1758, a Jewish botanist and zoologist. His taxonomy, or his rhythm of or method of classification, was meant for plants and animals, not for humans. It wasn't until Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was a German physician and naturalist and anthropologist, who decided to use it to classify race. And he used a method of, at the time, called craniometry, or craniology as we generally call it today. And they measure the brain, the skull. He came up with 5 different groups: Caucasian, the white race; Mongolian, the yellow race; Malayan, the brown race; Ethiopian, the black race; and American, the red race. Blumenbach insisted that Adam and Eve were Caucasian, inhabitants of Asia, and that other races grew out of them. They were degenerative, and actually the environmental, so much like the climate theory, the environmental factors changed them. The sun and poor nutrition made them the colors that they were. A lot of people are surprised when they hear, when I teach my classes, that there was racism in Canada. So what I'm going to do is go through the history of Canada, or history of racism in Canada. I can't obviously include all groups, and I can't include all the information. I get carried away when I start to research this, and I want to include everything. So I'm going to just try to highlight some of the main points. Some of it you'll be familiar with, some of it you won't be familiar with, but if you have any questions, feel free to send them along the way. So let's start with Indigenous people. Indigenous people had their own complex social, political, economic, and cultural systems before the Europeans came to North America. During the 1400s and 1500s, European explorers captured Indigenous people in North America and brought them back to Europe as slaves. In the 1600s, they were exchanged for trade goods and became an essential part of England's southern colonies, as they relied almost completely on Indigenous slaves. African slaves weren't as popular because they were more expensive. In about 45 years, there were about 50,000 Indigenous slaves who were traded or captured in what is now the United States, or the southern United States in particular. around 1715 to 1717, the indigenous nations in Britain fought the Yamsay War to stop slave trade. And so Europe shifted their dependence on indigenous slaves and moved to African slaves. Indigenous people continued to be used as slaves at a smaller scale until abolishment. They were shipped to the West Indies to trade for African slaves. And often African slaves were used because they were considered larger and able to carry heavier loads and do more work. Indigenous people were enslaved in New France until 1783. In 1805, Europeans decided who would be considered Indian and who would not. In 1882, amendments to the Indian Act was made. So all of this is going on while Indigenous people, who are people, have no say in it. As I mentioned earlier, who would be considered Indian was performed by the Anthropology Division of Geological Survey. And on their own, they decided who would be in what tribe and what group without consulting the Indigenous people themselves. In 1882, the Indian Act forced children out of their home. They came in, took them out of their home, put them into what we know as residential schools. They were calling them boarding or industrial schools without the consent of their parents. If their parents tried to fight them, as any parent would, they were put into jail. About 150 Indigenous children were sent to residential schools, and that number is going to vary depending on your source. I'm going to skip to a couple other points, and I'd be happy to share my notes if anybody wants to, just so that we have time. A big point that I think is all of it's worth talking about, but pointing out is that in 1955, the Canadian Association of Social Workers thought that Indigenous children weren't being raised well enough. And so they went again into their homes and took them from their parents, put them into group homes, or into white families across the world, not just across the country, but across the world as well. So obviously these parents never saw their children again. This practice didn't stop until 1981, if you could believe it. In 1960, Aboriginal people had the right to vote. 1960, I said. That's 1960. And it's worth pointing out that Japanese, Chinese, and South Asians were given the vote in 1942. So they were voting before even Indigenous people were. And if they did vote, they would lose their status. Okay, so I am going to move on to Black Canadians, and I'll also cut my notes on this too, because I can go on forever. The first free Black person in Canada came, Matthew da Costa, in 1605, and he was hired by Samuel de Champlain as a translator for an excursion. The first slave of African descent was Olivier de June. He was 6 years old, and he was captured in 1629 and shipped directly from Africa to Canada and sold to a French clerk in Quebec. In 1689, King Louis XIV officially authorized importation of enslaved Black people to provide forced labor in New France, and that was where most of the activity took place. I think it's important to point out that there was slavery. It was active, very active in Canada. A lot of people don't know that. So in history class, when I was teaching students, I would hear they knew of a lot of other racist events that took place in Canada, but very few knew about racism. It went on for about 200 years. About 3,000 slaves, men, women, and children, came to Canada after the British North America government enticed white Americans to come to Canada by passing a law that they could bring their slaves. Owning slaves became such a normal part of Canadian life that people from all socioeconomic levels, didn't matter whether they were rich or poor, educated or not, or what political beliefs they had, but they all held slaves, they all owned slaves. There is a story about Africville that I'd like to get into at some point, and maybe we'll talk about it after, but it was an establishment in Nova Scotia that the 3,000 Black loyalists came into because they fought against the Americans for the English. They became loyalists who earned their freedom. And they started a development in Halifax called Africville that was completely destroyed after it became successful, basically. And to make a long story short, they were asked to leave. They refused to, but that was not before they put an infectious diseases hospital around it, a plant. They ran the railroad through it, trying to get them to leave. They refused to leave, even when they asked to or offered to pay them. So on a Sunday morning when they all went to church, the government sent in bulldozers and garbage trucks, and they slammed their homes down and dumped everything out. And anyway, many of them ended up moving on to out of Canada and to Sierra Leone. And other Blacks followed years later in 1800s to do the same thing. In August 28th, 1833, the British Parliament abolished slavery, but it didn't end there because Canada participated in informal slavery in Nova Scotia. And often they were kidnapped in Upper Canada. Canadians would kidnap African slaves and bring them to the US to sell. Okay, I'm going to move on to Chinese Canadians. How much time do I have there? Okay, I'm going to go fast. I guess for the most part, Chinese were welcomed into the country starting at about 1788, but the larger immigration took place in 1958, and that was to build the railroad. Oh, sorry, let me change that. About 15,000 came in around 1880 to 1885. My dates are never good, to participate in building the railway. That would not have succeeded, the government would say, because if they weren't involved. 600 died because of the poor working conditions. And then after the railroad was built, they were ushered out. There were many laws. There was the head tax that you know of that started at $50, and by the end of it was $500 per person, trying to keep Chinese from entering the country. In 1923, the Chinese Immigration Act suspended Chinese immigration altogether so that none would enter. And there were a number of acts, the Chinese Regulation Act, the Act to Prevent Chinese Immigration, and the Naval Act that also prohibited their immigrating to the country. Japanese Canadian immigration started around 1877 and to 1928. And of course, in 1967, there was a big influx of immigrants from many parts of the world, mostly immigrants of color. With the Japanese immigrants, only men were allowed until 1907, and then men were not allowed. In the Gentleman's Act, I think it was called the Gentleman's Agreement, they were not permitted to come in. But they also faced a lot of hate and discrimination. They were considered the yellow peril. The white supremacists came into their developed area and destroyed all of their homes and their businesses, and they often were excluded from participating in areas that they hoped to. Important event that took place, I'm sure as many of you know, is the Japanese internment. And just to try to summarize it, it was March 1942, and about 20,000, let's say 21,000 Japanese immigrants were forced to evacuate their homes in 2 hours. Many of them were fishermen. Their boats were confiscated and impounded, auctioned off. Their homes, their farms, fishing boats, their businesses were sold. All their belongings were sold at very cheap cost at the auction, and the money was taken and put in their accounts so that they could pay rent. And you wonder where they pay rent if they lost their homes. 80,000 of them were taken, women and children, to Hastings Park. And they were made to live in 14 by 24 foot rooms and had to pay rent for it. The men were working in the interior and paid $5 a month. And if they resisted, they were sent to prisoner of war camps in Ontario and clothed in big overalls with a big circle on the back. And historians will argue it was a target, but the government insisted then that it was for their flag. So keep in mind that they'd been in Canada so many years, they were Canadian. They were second generation being born. But in 1945, the government gave them two options. They could go to Japan. The idea was go back to Japan, but many had never been there. And the second was to go east of the Rockies. So the population would have been much larger in Vancouver, but they were removed. I have information about South Asians that I won't cover. But again, if anyone would like to talk about it, I will, as well as Jewish people. And I could continue with many more. I'd like to go through it, but I have a half hour, and that's not a lot of time to do it. But I guess I should summarize that every group that came to the country, it started with Eastern Europeans who were discriminated against, but they were naturally enveloped or pulled in. They weren't considered white and eventually turned white. They were seen as white. For groups of color, some sociologists, Park in particular, expected that they'd be able to enter the country and go through the same process, but they weren't. They were unable to, obviously, because of the color of their skin. And so when it didn't happen, the racism continued to take place. All of them experienced segregation, through the legal justice system, education system, employment, healthcare. They weren't able to buy homes. They weren't able to vote. They weren't able to gain citizenship or participate in the military. In all of the cases, every group had troops that wanted to participate in the war. And some were able to, but generally either put in the front or put farther away doing farm work or something else, not actually participating. They were banned from particular jobs and sectors and from labor unions, and they were segregated in areas of education, and often having to use service or public entrances to get into facilities if they were permitted to come in. So I feel like I sped through that, and it's unfortunate because I would love to have just lingered a little bit, but hopefully in person we could do that and have a conversation. We'll talk about, hopefully through your questions, individual racism and systemic racism, because there is a question whether it exists. But I would say if you look at the flow of what's gone on in the past, it's probable that it continues. And statistically, it's proof that it continues, that systemic racism still goes on. We know that race is a social concept. And again, more information on the Genome Project would give that to you, that I'm running past as well, but would love to spend more time talking about at some point. So I have been, as I've been telling you, using my journal quite a bit, or not my journal, my devotional, reading my devotional quite a bit. And there is something that I read that, again, just last week spoke to me. Cowan says, "Isn't it glorious to know that no matter how unjust something may be, even when it seems to have come from Satan himself, by the time it reaches us, it is God's will for us and will ultimately work to do our good." So I'm in no way saying this is a good thing, but I will say that through my taking in the events of the last few months, it's been very difficult and very emotional. And knowing that God has his hand on it is the only thing that gives me full hope. I would recommend that we have some sort of a response to this as Christians, because I think that this is where most of, if not all of the change should take place. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to start by just moving this out of the way here. But next I'll say thank you for everything that you've prepared. And people already are very appreciative online, people that are joining us now. We understand it's a tall order to ask a sociologist with a PhD to go, can you give us a crash course here and there? But that's why this is one conversation of others that we've been having, and more we can have too.
Yes.
So I do want to reference, if you're on Instagram, you can find a great conversation that Jennifer had earlier this year with Ricky. I had a conversation with another sociologist, Mike Wilkinson, and much of that history and dialogue has happened. So there's other places already for you to find resources, and we can do more in the future as well. But thank you for so much of that. And we've had conversations, but I appreciate the mini lecture myself, because there's so much that I pick up with that. And I'm just so thankful for your consideration, your time with us, and that. So, again, we're just going to welcome you to, to ask any questions that you want. I've already got too many.
Okay, I'm ready for them. But hopefully, we can get into some of the issues that I couldn't cover.
I think that's our hope, right? As we talked about in our conversation. Yeah. So maybe the first one's this, and allow me to preface it a little bit with some of what I picked up from what you just shared with us.
Okay.
Looking back into ancient history, right? You referenced Aristotle and not climate theory. What's the climate of the word that you use for that? That about where people live and worth attributed to them because of where they are within a climate globally.
Yes.
Looking from Aristotle, moving through all the history that you moved us through, right into Canadian history. You'll say there's 200 years of slavery in Canada, the Indigenous abuses, obviously, and the systemic racism that you said is probable. Let's push that farther and say it's extremely probable. It's happened. It's the reality.
Yes.
A friend of mine, a psychologist actually, said to me, it's really hard for us to reckon with our histories, be it as individuals or as groups. Why do you feel, from your vantage point, that we're hesitant as Canadians to say there's racism in Canada, there's a history of racism, and that we very well could be a racist society now? Why is there hesitancy there?
Well, first of all, there's such discomfort in talking about race. We like to uphold our politeness, but I think there's been a habit of burying it. There are historical records that show how much has happened, and very disappointing that it hasn't made its way into the schools. So it's not talked about. So even Japanese internment, it's changing that to an amount, a small amount. You see change moving forward. People know about Japanese internment. There are a lot of other things that I talked about and would like to have talked about that most students never know about. So they grow up never knowing that it existed. So there's a question of there being able to embrace something like racism. The other is we really push the multiculturalism trope. We like to say we like all people, we embrace everyone. We're comfortable with having the cultural garb and eating each other's food. But when it comes to looking at what has happened, the injustices that have taken place, we want to just gloss over that. And I think even as people of color in Canada, we've learned to not talk about it too much. Even in the work I was doing, I couldn't say racism. And so this switch that's happened where I can use racism freely is remarkable to me. Because when I was doing work, diversity work, I was always asked not to use it. Doing anti-racism work, I had to, but that came with a lot of kickback. So I just think that we've not practiced using it like they might in the US. And so therefore we don't have the comfort of using it.
That makes a lot of sense. And if I can press that beyond just like broadly Canada, like why as an individual is it sometimes hard for me to go, I'm not, there's not racism in my heart. I like sushi. How can I eat the different food. I like the different experience. Why is it hard for us do you think, to own that sometimes? The reality, if we're coming out of a history where, why can't we say, we're obviously a part of that lineage to some degree?
I think that a lot of people are very sensitive, and using the word racism is like an insult.
Right.
It's a jab. And I think if people had a better understanding of what systemic racism means, they might go, you know what, let me step back and see if that's the case. But instead, they resort to hiding or denying or fighting. When people talk about systemic racism being the case, if we were to think of living in a place where racism is the norm without us realizing it, some of us don't realize it. People of color, most will tell you they do. And Indigenous people, of course. So if you're living in a society where you don't realize it's there and someone else is telling you it is there, you don't have to believe it. You're not impacted by it. And I'll throw in my research that I'm doing on mixed race couples. It's funny because the white partner will say they may not have known it, but the minute they are in the experience with their Black partner
Mm.
or their mixed race kids, they suddenly start seeing,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, this is real, and it's shocking to them. And
Yeah.
their Black partner's going, yeah, this is
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
And so they start to see in a probably a unique way. They're not fully engaging or being the target of racism, but being in a family, they're starting to get a little bit of a view that other people would not see, other white people wouldn't get a chance to see. So, sorry, go back to your question again. What was it?
You answered
I
it,
did?
and
Okay.
more so.
Okay.
And what I hear from that, and I could be wrong in what I'm hearing, but there's this sense of we do have some individual and collective experiences of which we maybe just need to be mindful of. That my experience is not everybody's experience.
Absolutely.
And sometimes we walk around the world just going, no, like everyone experiences the world the
That's
way
right.
that I do.
That is probably the biggest stumbling block for people, because what I find in my training is women could go there, white women could go there a little bit easier than white men, because I could talk to them about the discrimination they faced or read about.
Right.
And so it's easy for them to go, okay, it was happening to me, so it must be real. But white men may not have faced this. And I'm not talking about a huge generalization that white men have never felt discriminated against for something, but it's not racism, not in North America anyway. And if it is, it isn't from a dominant group.
Sure.
And that's a different situation altogether.
Yeah.
But the point I was making is, when you live in a country where everything that you are taking in, your education, the way policies are made in organizations, all the rest, you're taking it in and not realizing that it's neglecting to meet needs or even respect other people who are living there. Yeah. So we start to assume, even people of color, ideas that are incorrect. So you have a lot of self-hate, people who are Black or Asian start to feel like, I wish I was. And you talk to a lot of young people of color and they'll say, I wish I was white when I was a child. And it's a shameful thing for them, but it shouldn't be, because you've grown up in a place where whiteness is glorified so much, right? Yeah. And so what you are not represented in places of power or I don't know, places that people prefer to be, possibly, and represented in maybe in more impoverished area or less education. So you want to get out of that, assuming that race is connected to that behavior, not realizing that so much of history has put you in that position. Yeah.
I think that's a helpful insight, because it helps us to realize that we are all under this delusion. We're all affected by this. We're all drawn in. It's not these people over here are racist and some of these people are not. It's like, well, what history has brought us to means that we're all implicated in this, in a sense, and we all view it that way. And I've heard a similar conversation around sexism, and particularly around, let's say, an actress who's learned to act a certain way in order to get a role, and all of a sudden goes, hold on, I'm playing into the very hands of these things I don't believe in, because it's learned behavior that's so lengthy in their history. So it doesn't surprise to hear that perhaps, like white women can access that understanding because of what they've experienced in terms of sexism. They can go, okay, maybe that's possible, how that might be a bit more difficult for a white man.
Yes.
Yeah. We've got some questions rolling in, but before we get to them, I want to get to the question of race as a social construct.
Yes.
And, I don't know if you said this tonight, but I know in a conversation that we've had before, and it might have been the conversation that you had with Ricky, that we need to move to a place where we can say that everyone around me is more like me than unlike me. Yes. How do we do that? How is that work done?
Well, genetically, that is actually the case. If you're talking socially, how we break through that idea of racial differences, I know that it doesn't make sense to say, go out and find people who look different than you. What I would say is, meet people who don't like you, and don't meet them for the sake of just saying, I need a Black person in my friend group. So there's got to be a sincere effort to know people. Yeah. And when you know them, and they hurt when you hurt, they have the same worries for their kids or their parents, or have the same goals and dreams and ambitions, then you start to feel something. Yeah. And it feels like you're connecting with them, so that if something like they get shot in the street, your heart hurts.
Yeah.
Right. And there have been, you're hearing this again and again in the news. This isn't the first, second, or third shootings. This has been going on forever.
Yeah.
And to Black people, this has been going on since slavery.
Yeah.
Right. We've seen it happen in our homes where we're at risk for going out, and Indigenous people will tell you the same story. Just getting in a car is something that a parent is going to fear her son doing because, or his son doing, because someone could stop them and it could go sideways.
Yeah.
So I think once you know people and are involved in their lives, they matter to you as much as people that look like you.
Yeah.
And I know that people say, they try to make that point by saying, I don't see your color. And I just want to caution that, because
let's talk about that for a second.
You have to see color.
Yeah.
Because my experience, a person of color, their life has been shaped because of their color. So much of what's gone on has impacted them just because of the way they look.
Yeah.
So you can spin it. I shouldn't even say spin it. I was raised loving who I am as a Black woman, as a Black child, and growing up to be a Black woman. So I want you to see that. That's not something for me to be ashamed of or to hide. That's something that I want to celebrate. So when you are with a person of color and you're telling them, well, I don't think of you as that, which I've heard a number of times, but I want you to think of me as that, but I want you to see it as a positive thing.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Can we pause on that for a second? Because when we say I don't see color, it's almost as if we're speaking of color as something that is negative.
Yes.
And you're saying, well, no, let's see that and embrace that about who we each are.
Yes.
That's a really subtle thing that I don't think a lot of us pick up on.
Well, and I would say, I can't speak for everyone, because I'm sure there are people of color who would say, oh, thank goodness. But that isn't a good thing.
Right.
If they are not comfortable, if they've lived in a world where they should feel more comfortable with being invisible than being seen for who they are, then there's something wrong.
Yeah. I think that's implicitly Christian as well. I mean, when you began by talking about painting a picture for us of heaven, we will all be there, and we are one, but there is a beautiful diversity to the planet and to all of us. And so that's not to be shuttered away or to be glazed over. It's to be embraced and to be celebrated and considered. So I think we are learning in this time as well. A lot of the things that we think are helpful are not helpful, which is why we need to listen and learn and ask questions and grow. Man, there's just so many trails we can go down. This is so thankful. I'm so insightful, Jennifer. Thank you. So when I say, like, how's that work done? I think I'm hearing you talk. I'm hearing you talk about maybe some empathy and some understanding, some seeking to understand. So I can ask you a question that pertains to the past and even maybe the past number of months.
Okay.
For you personally, if that's okay. Like, what's the last few months been like for you? You can speak to your whole life, but maybe particularly the last few months.
Oh, it's just been a roller coaster ride, I think. It was, I think, when George Floyd was first murdered, it's awful to say, but I thought, not again. But I have learned, and maybe my household has learned to see it, to talk about it, and it remains very private. And suddenly there was a switch that flipped and everybody was talking about it. And some people were calling me and there were things being posted, and this was so different than anything that I'd ever seen before. So I had to learn how to be public about those emotions. I talk about being masked, and I talked about having almost being duplicit in my personalities, where there's the person that I show everyone else. And then there's a grieving person who hurts for the stuff that's gone on, not just in my life, but in other people of color and Indigenous people's lives. And that was being exposed a little bit. So it felt uncomfortable that so many people wanted to engage. Good on one hand, but on the other hand, almost like they were opening me up to show who I hadn't been in the habit of showing, and not knowing how to let that out safely. It was a vulnerability that I hadn't experienced and wasn't sure if I wanted to. Yeah. And then there was, and you and I talked about this, I was doing a lot of talking and seminars and workshops and putting things on myself. And I was going at a ridiculous pace and really burnt myself out because I felt like there was a small window and I could see it every day closing.
Right.
While there are non-people of color, I'll say,
Yeah.
white people, who are interested in this. While there's such a large mass of the dominant population wanting to know, I wanted to put out as much as I was able to do and have change happen.
Yeah.
But I said my fear was that that window would close and no one would want to talk. And you can even see bits of that happening.
Yeah.
Maybe before Jacob Taylor was shot.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like, people are saying it's divisive, it's uncomfortable, I don't want to go there anymore. Imagine the life of a person who has to every single day for their entire life, how exhausting that is. So you learn to live off that exhaustion.
Mm-hmm.
And when there's not a privilege to just say, it's too much to think about, you can't do anything but continue moving in the direction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've talked about that weariness, or knowing that a media cycle is going to wind down, and maybe there's that thought that you can have I'm sure this will blow over in a bit.
Yeah.
But I thought it was just interesting when we talked a couple of months ago about the fact that we have to understand the time that we're in now as not a moment, but the possibility for a movement.
Yeah.
And so what's given you some hope that there is some movement as you've been doing the vast amount of work that you have been doing?
I think that I have hope because people are asking the hard questions that they hadn't been able to, going places they hadn't, looking, learning. I think that's a start. For the deeper change that has to happen, I think this is generational. So, the common phrase of it's a marathon, it would be used there. This is going to go on forever. Maybe my grandbabies or their babies will see a different world. But this didn't just start here. There have been other movements that have happened. We just can hope that it'll progress us farther into a place that we should be. And that the younger generation gives me a ton of hope, because they are just so vocal and no nonsense. They don't want to see this happening and they won't have it. So there's a lot we could be learning from them as well. Yeah.
I feel like that also allows us to see ourselves in history and to go, we've arrived here. We are historical beings and we have a role to play. And particularly as Christians and as a church, we have a role to play. And sometimes the anxiety, I think, comes maybe from that sense of, well, we can't solve all this. So let's just go, God's good and he'll sort it out when heaven comes. Like, well, but no, like there's a wonderful history of moving towards equality in harmony. So what's our role to play in that? As much as we had a role in the church 60 years ago, 100 years ago, like what's our role now?
I think you first have to say injustice has been done. Like acknowledge that it's been done, and then decide on some strategy to move forward. Sitting back and not saying anything or doing anything is no longer an option. There are people who are vocal, and there are people who are gutted and devastated by what's going on in the world. And if the church isn't a place to open their arms and not just give lip service to the change, but actually force the change, if they're not going to do that, they won't reach the hearts of people, right? There are people searching, and you know that, for everything that can give some sort of a calm, be a balm to them, right? That's what we're supposed to be. And I just feel like as Christians, we've really dimmed our light. We worry about being too much in the world and assuming too much of the culture that's going on. But I think inactivity is the culture that we've assumed. And what we should be doing is looking in the Word where that Christ wouldn't stand for that sort of thing. And that's how we should be reacting. Yeah.
That inactivity, I think, is a really important word. And I think we've talked a little bit about this before in Acts 6, where we see racism right away in the life of the church, where you've got a certain group of people being served better than another group of people. And it's the Greek widows and the Jewish widows. And right away say, well, the church has just been born and it's occurring. And sometimes we view the church as this kind of bubble and the world can't get in. It's like, and yet we're made up of the world. We're in it, right?
That's right.
What inspires me about what we see in Acts, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, you're going to tell everybody how it ends.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought you were going to move on from that.
No, what inspires me about Acts 6 is they go, oh dear, this is a problem. This is not the way of Jesus.
Yes.
We have to do something. And what they did something about it. And that's where we get the creation of the role of deacon,
Yeah.
of people to physically make sure that everyone is being treated. And so
Fairly.
I think
Yeah.
that though, yes, we have a history of racism within the birth of the church and the life of the church, we also very quickly have a response and activity to it.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if that gives you any hope or help, but
Absolutely,
Yeah.
it does. I think you get back on track, and I think you see it in history,
Yeah.
is where the church falls off. Someone holds the word up and says, no, 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 and
Yeah.
it gets back on track. So
Yeah.
I see that happening again. And when I talked about God allowing this to happen and using it, I think that's exactly it. The world has a wake-up call, but Christians have, I think, a bigger wake-up call
Mhm.
to see that this is happening and undeniably happening.
Yeah.
And really having to look in the mirror and say, so what do we do about it?
Yeah. Yeah. But I just appreciate you saying we just have to own it first.
Yeah.
And I wonder how so much of that as Christians we don't want to own because we think that we have to sort it out and do it all. And it's hard to see ourselves under the work of God as a good shepherd who ultimately is doing that work with us. And we feel like it's totally honest, but he's going to partner with us in that.
Yeah.
And the Spirit's going to partner with us. And we have a role to play, and then we pass the baton as we go. And I don't know, for me, Jennifer, to be completely honest, that feels freeing. It goes,
Yes.
I don't have to solve racism, even in my own life fully. I just have to do the work, partner with God, and pass it on. And hopefully the next generation can continue to see things move forward.
If we're completely to God, to living as Christians, it means that in humility, we learn how to love people.
Yeah.
And if anything is, I don't know what is more simplistic than that. I'm not saying
Yeah.
it's easy,
Yeah.
but it's a very simple message, right?
Yeah.
To love our neighbors, to love each other. And I think we see those words and we just kind of pass over them without having that deep thinking. If we're to love everybody as we love ourselves, then we're not looking at the color. We're not, and if we're allowing God and allowing His Holy Spirit to really take hold of that, and that's a humility, especially in our context, in our society. It's a humility that a lot of us fight with.
Yeah.
We want to reclaim ourselves, but it keeps us from getting to a place where we can put all of those guards or past beliefs aside and just really embrace people in a sincere way.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, oh, ignore it, that racism existed. I think, as I said, that has to be acknowledged, and also acknowledge the hurt that's been done through the church and even your immediate circle of people.
Yeah.
You know, how do we show them that God is not this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Humility is so much the defining feature of Jesus. As we read in Philippians, this is what's lifted up in us in the character of God. And I think that for me, as I've been working through so many conversations over the last number of months and trying to do my own work internally, and Sarah and I having conversations at home, and I just keep coming back to that word humility and go, like, if we're not willing to at least check ourselves and go, if we're not willing to even ask the question of where am I harming? Where have we hurt? Where might there be a problem? Because we're not willing to love, then there's no humility there. And that's what we're led into, which humility leads us into love. And I appreciate you drawing that word out, because no matter where we end up going with our own journeys, if we're not willing to start at least with humility of going, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
And you know, we've said that before, you know, over the last couple of months here, of saying the church is not the place that goes, we've got it right. The church is the people who go, we're willing to say we've got it wrong. And that's what the cross is for. And that's what it's all about.
Our main culture should be one of humility.
Yeah.
And I think that we often do not put ourselves there. We're fighting to show, you know, we have rights and we have this. We're pushing beyond what Christ asked us to be.
Yeah.
And I think that humility is what He expects from us, what He lived Himself.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a few questions coming through on here. So I'm just going to look a little bit at them and pay attention to them for a little bit.
Okay.
And then come back to some of these other ones. People are really appreciating the crash course. Absolutely.
I apologize.
Yeah.
Crash.
No, this is great. And some of these I think we've covered a little bit. But one person asked, what are some areas of systemic racism in our area that we may not be fully aware of, that we could look at getting involved in and seeing some movement going forward?
Okay. In what area do you think they're referring to?
I don't know. Like, what are areas of systemic racism that that we don't see? Let's talk
Okay.
about Langley, and what can we do if we're living in Langley and there's issues of systemic racism, and what can we do to participate to see that change?
Oh, there's just so many. Like, if I can start from childhood, you think about the schools, right? You think about if there's representation in the school, and people get uncomfortable with the idea of racial representation. I hate to use race because I just told you it wasn't a thing, but it isn't about quotas as much as it's about what barriers have been put into place to not allow people to be sitting in those seats. If I look at university and I look at the people who are graduating from, say, education, are they represented when they're out in the school?
Yeah.
And is it to be of the belief that there is no person of color qualified enough to be in the positions that they should be? So I think you start looking at your teachers, you start looking at who your kids are looking to as educators. There should be a mix there.
Yeah.
You look at what's being taught in the educational system, if it is diverse, if all Canadians are reflected in the history that we're teaching. If it is respectful and not insulting to groups, which it is. And I know in the past, in the 80s, the whole political correctness thing came out. It's political correct if you're not affected by it, maybe, but if you're living it every day, it's nothing about being politically correct. You know, for a child of color to come home and say, I hate my color, I hate who I am, we should all be uncomfortable with that taking place. Looking at jobs, organizations, who's on top? Are you seeing the lower people who are in the lower end? I don't want to talk higher and lower, but in entry level positions, mainly people of color, and in the upper ranks, they're not. I think there are just so many. I could spend hours alone, like talking on that alone. Because it is in every system out there. Yeah. You know, if you look at policing or the criminal justice system, there's an article by Amnesty, I think sponsored by the United Nations. Black men are 20 times likely to be killed in an altercation with police. Indigenous and Black men are 2 to 3 times more likely to be stopped on a frisk and stop or a carding or pulled over, right? When they're just seen in the car, nothing's wrong, but they're being pulled over. Like, these are things that are happening every day to individuals. So to sit back complacently and to feel like, oh, it doesn't involve me, what can I do? It's a shame. We can't do that. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Some other, questions that I have that I want us to be just mindful of. As a person of faith, we talked about this a little bit the other day, and I really want us to be just as vulnerable as we can together. But what's been hard about living your faith out in light of the realities of racism and inequality and being a part of the church? What's been incongruent and really difficult?
Are you talking just through the last few months or consistently? Consistently. I would say that the church has been a place that I could go, and I'm in Langley. There are not a lot of Black people, or there are a lot of people of color, but I would say not in my church and not in a lot of the areas that I am. And I would say that there is a mask that I wear on a regular basis. And I think that others can probably speak to the same thing. Is when something goes on, the Charlottesville shootings, Charlottesville shootings.
Yeah, Charlottesville, yeah.
Where 9 Christians were killed, and I came to church and nothing was mentioned. Like, that sort of thing has been very difficult because I grew up in my faith knowing that we're supposed to be brothers and sisters. And my feeling is, if I have brothers and sisters, I should be able to bring my full self, and containing that on a regular basis. And it's not just in church or Christian circles, it's life, right? Unless I get around people who get it. But I can imagine what it would be if everybody, all my brothers and sisters, not just those of color, are going, yeah, I get that. That must be hard. And I think that that's what we try to reach to. Just being real. I think in the last little while, what's been difficult is the energy, but what's been hopeful is the desire for what I see happening here, the desire to learn, the desire to grow, the desire to understand and see change. And I hope that continues. That's been hopeful for me. But I would say I don't want to go back to where I was, because once this has come to be, I don't want to put that back in the box. I want to come to the table fully myself and free to express what I need to express, just like everybody else should be able to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really well said. And appreciate your vulnerability with that. And that's, I mean, so much of our hope, even as a local church, is that value of authenticity, of going, I want to turn up just who I am.
Yeah.
And that's not easy to do at any point in life, but especially in a place like a church where we're trying to be vulnerable with one another. And I think that sometimes it's a polite and a nice idea to kind of say that. But to actually do it is a whole other ball game. And so it takes bravery to even say that. And I appreciate you sharing that, Jennifer. That. I asked a little bit earlier about what's given you some hope about this. And I would say, like, I can't imagine your experience, right? But it probably, this kind of conversation probably feels a little way too late, barely a starting point in your life's experience. And a hope that more will come from this. But in the midst of that, as you've inclined yourself towards your friends, towards your local church, towards, what, other than what you said already, what does give you hope? Maybe I could say in the spirit, like, what do you feel God would be encouraging you in?
I will be honest. And now you say it, and I'm going to backtrack just a little bit, but not take us too long.
No, we got lots of time.
I felt very distant from God when all this was happening, and I've been there before. When this sort of thing happens, it really brings me to my knees, but not in a good way, but it's a good place to cry out. And sometimes I'm silent and walk away because it's hard to see people being treated less than. And I know that's not a part of what he promises. But in the time that's passed, he's given me a calm. There's no question. He's given me a calm to see that this is change on its way. And so that's my hope. It may not come as fast as I hoped. And in another interview I did, I said, I never wanted my boys to have to experience this. And I remember when I was marrying Scott, my dad said, what if there's a racial war and whites go one way and blacks go another way? And I thought, oh my gosh, how could that happen? Look at where we're at right now. Yeah. It's a scary thing. Yeah. So I believe that this doesn't happen there's a reason for it. It's not done in vain. I'm not saying God wanted it, but he'll use it. And if we're supposed to be moving in the direction he wants us, we need to let him use us. As vulnerable and as uncomfortable as it might be, we need to just throw ourselves into it. And I'm hoping to be a part of that. Yeah. And I'm hoping that our congregations and people that we impact are hoping to do the work as difficult. And I know it'll be difficult, and I know it'll be uncomfortable, but it's got to start somewhere. Yeah. And I'm anxious to do the same at Trinity, is just really talk about things that are difficult and make change that should have happened, in my opinion, hundreds of years ago.
Thanks for that. We've talked a little bit about this too, which I just want to touch on is the connection, especially what we've seen in the last few months of the pandemic.
Yes.
And how these two things correlate. And, some people say 2020 is the worst. And then people put back to that and go, actually, no, there's some really great things happening in 2020. They're hard things, but they're important and really good things. What relationship do you think, we could go on for hours with that, but is going on between the pandemic and so much lockdown, and then what we're seeing in terms of some of the shifts and conversations that are going on?
I just think that we have gotten used to being lulled to sleep on so many levels. Like there is a lot going on in the world, but we're tied up. We could say it's devices and social media and all the rest, but what it comes down to is distraction. We're doing 50 things at one time. We're called to go away into quiet. There's a reason for that. And the pandemic has really forced us to get quiet.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can have your TV on, you can have your phone in your hand, you can do, but so much slow down our pace of life that we can't help but stop and look at what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's what has happened is people were quiet. People were watching what was shown on the news. People saw what was going on, and it hit most of us in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's, in my mind, a gift,
Mm-hmm.
right? And maybe something that we could self-impose in the future is just slowing down, being quiet,
Mm-hmm.
and even listening to what the Spirit might be telling us as well.
That's really interesting that you went that direction. That could be my next question.
Okay.
As we do that, when people use the phrase, you got to do the work. I want to back that up to what it means as a Christian to do the work. And you just referenced slowing down, being quiet, and listening. What would you imagine a prayer sounding like for someone who wants to lay themselves humbly before God? And what kind of prayer what would that prayer sound like to want to be open and to grow when it comes to reconciliation, when it comes to being ownership of injustice? What does that prayer sound like?
Well, I don't know. I think that our prayers might sound different. What would your prayer sound like?
Oh God, I don't know where to begin.
Yeah.
Probably starts there
Yeah.
a little bit.
And I think that's a part of the humility, right? Is not knowing. I could have a ton of ideas, but I've been working those ideas for years, and I've had no power, right? And so I'm at the point where it's got to be, God's got to open that up and show me. And I think when people are willing, I think that would be my prayer, is just the willingness to go where He wants me to go.
Yeah.
And be sensitive enough to know when it's me and my feelings getting hurt, and when it is something that it's discomfort that we have to go through.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think we've learned in the church to smile all the time. Hard times are going and we're smiling, but I think to be completely real and vulnerable is a beautiful thing. We're closest to God when we're most broken often. And I think that we are broken right now. Kirsten talked about, us lamenting. We're in that situation. We're in that position to be lamenting and praying and grieving and crying. And I think, why not come together as much as we can when we're social distancing and start looking at how we envision what God wants this world to look like, or envision heaven to be, actually. And how we bring that here.
Can I pull out a few things I heard you say there that struck me? I think I heard we come back again to the theme of humility. And before we talked about this, that often in the conversation, things rise to the top. I feel like humility rises to the top. Lamenting, which connects to ownership and facing the truth, but then also looking at the gospel and going, there is a hopeful future, but we got to start with maybe those two places. If at least we have to begin there with a level of humility and a willingness to grieve and to face what's unjust and to face what's evil.
Well, and let me not leave out anger as you play it back to me. I think, anger is going to come out of a lot of people. And I think having the patience and humility to allow that to flow as well. Because when you've got years of bunged up pain inside of you, it's got to come out, and that's going to be a part of it. And again, I think that Canadians, not just Christians, but Canadians are very uncomfortable with that. I don't want you, it's not directed to you. And I think we have to start taking ourselves out of that position where we're that important. It is what people have experienced, they've experienced. You can't take it away. You can't make it better. You can't explain it to be something else. Just take it at their word that this is what's gone on, because you don't know, right? And so allowing them to express it however they do. People get frustrated with me because I don't know if this is my mask or if it's just what God put in me. I'm told I'm calm. I don't feel calm all the time. And my kids and my husband will tell you I'm not always calm. But I can do this stuff and stay calm. And I'd say that's from God. But not everybody can. And I know that other people who do this work will get totally upset with me and say, you know what, you should be shaking your fist and whatever else. It isn't who I am. I could pretend to be that. But I do think there's a gentleness that God gave me and will hopefully use through this. But don't expect the way I am is the way that everybody else is going to be through it, and have that grace and patience as they go through it and understand that there's a reason why they're feeling it.
Yeah. I think that takes us back to empathy.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think we get to empathy before we begin with humility, right? That sense of going, let's make room for people who are going to experience what they're experiencing. And again, to love our neighbor as we love ourselves.
Right.
How would we like to be treated? We'd like for people to make room for everything we feel that we bring into the room, and everything we've experienced. There's a couple more questions that, and we're kind of probably coming towards the end of our time.
I think I might have gotten some as well.
You're getting texted the questions.
Yes,
they're going straight to you, which is great. Is there anything on there you want to pull out? Or
no, I was getting shared.
Oh, you're getting cheered on. Well, that's awesome. But this is a very connected to Langley question. Do you think there is unconscious and implicit bias to minority cultures / ethnicity in the Langley society? I feel like we go,
absolutely,
yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm having a bit of a problem with the whole implicitness. People are talking about it so much, but I looked at a Ipsos, I'll just say, survey that said a lot of the younger category of Canadians are saying, it's just normal. Yeah, and I don't believe that. I do believe that it's implicit, but I think it's implicit because we have lived in a place where this sort of, racism and hate and whatever else has been normalized. So it just feels like, you talk to someone who's experienced what they experience and they hurt a person of color, and then they walk away and kind of go, and it just becomes normal. That shouldn't be, but it's because we've lived in this.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about it being implicit, that's what makes it implicit. But to say it's just normal to have preferred feelings towards one group and not to another, I wouldn't go there. I would say, why is it there? And that's work you do on your own.
Yeah.
That we'll all have. If I'm uncomfortable with a group, what do I need to do? How do I challenge myself?
Yeah.
And make it clear that it's not okay, but to accept it as being normal, I don't buy.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic answer to that question. So I think we are gonna wrap up.
Okay.
We've covered a whole bunch here and there. Like we said, not satisfied in many areas, but also, like I said, there's some themes that we've drawn out there. And I know there's lots of different people watching this from different places, but what I'm sensing in my spirit is this importance of humility, a sense of lament, and a sense of making room for others. And if we can begin there, then the foundation of that we can really build upon. So I'm thankful for how that's come out, along with all of the learning that we've done, especially through your lecture at the beginning. You began by praying. And I would be so thankful if you would pray for us again in this room, those that are watching, and pray what you feel the Spirit's leading us in this moment to close.
God, I am so grateful for the opportunity to be here and to talk. And I pray that you'll use everything that we talked about together and we thought about to grow. I pray that you'll put it in a place where it moves us all forward to become more of what you want us to be. We are your children. There's no question about that. So help us to live in that way. Help us to live as brothers and sisters, loving each other and learning how to love each other, Lord, and make that a process that you're involved with. I pray that you will be with every person who is here and who is listening, and those who tune in later, and speak to them however you feel they need to be spoken to. And open all of our hearts to just have more love and understanding for each other, but help us to not be afraid through all of this, Lord God. Be with us as we continue through this time and open up the conversations like they've never been opened before. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Jennifer, thank you, as I said before, for your insight, your generosity with us tonight and over the last number of months as we've been having conversations. But most of all, thank you for modeling humility, really.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. And thank you to everybody that's joined us tonight, both in the room and online. And just as we go forward and continue to have different kinds of conversations through our Grow sessions, we will have another slate of Grow sessions going on into the fall. And we'll be letting you know about what those are looking like over the next couple of weeks. But thanks for joining us tonight. And anything you want to say kind of in closing,
I
Jennifer?
think I said plenty.
Okay,
Yeah.
sounds good.
All right.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you soon.